I am as the name implies, I'm the director of the Division of Public Psychiatry at the University of Vermont. So public psychiatry, also kind of known as like community psychiatry, got me involved in technology. So I trained in Chicago, and I was working at a community mental health center not far from Wrigley Field. That's a whole nother story. And I really liked the work. And, but what I soon found myself thinking about, and I'm gonna steal Allie's line from her panel commentary earlier, working with people and then taking care of them, to make the analogy as plants, and then putting them back into a toxic environment. And it was very gratifying to work with people in the moment, in the room, but it was abundantly clear, even at the very beginning of my working in this field, that so much happened that was outside of our control, and that there was a lack of any kind of a system appreciation of what was happening for the people being served at community mental health centers, in homeless shelters, the people who spiral downward socioeconomically and really are dependent on the public dime, hence the name public psychiatry, and really careen from one non-communicating silo to the next. So again, like many important things in my life, I made a series of decisions, each of which was against my better judgment. And I wound up in an administrative position, clinical administrative position, and was in a position to actually do something about it at a systems level over the city of Chicago. And we put together, and this is back in, ironically, 2001, a very rudimentary, by today's standards, probably by those standards too, way of solving the following problem. There were 86 community mental health centers in the greater Chicago area. And there was a tremendous pressure for agencies to tell the Department of Mental Health they didn't have a waiting list because, you know, that's the whole political thing, no waiting lists, everything's going well. So the good news was they could generally say, honestly, we don't have a waiting list. The bad news is the reason they didn't have a waiting list is because people were falling off the back of the truck into the Cook County Jail every day, like to the tune of 500 people an afternoon. So that seemed like something that could be fixed. So we used this very rudimentary information system and made that impossible. And with that very minor, simple tweak, it fundamentally changed the treatment landscape, and it changed how people thought about what was possible. And that was like, if there's one take-home, well, there's probably 2 or 3 take-homes for you today, but that's one of them, is it doesn't take much to be disruptive in a field that people have grown accustomed to, but that fundamentally expands what is possible. And you can see dramatic changes when you do that, and we did see that. Not only did we see that as far as now we had a much more accurate count of who was falling off the back of the truck, but we noticed, you're all sitting down, so you're not going to be surprised by this, that when we looked at, because the jail was doing its own simple analysis of who had mental illness when they came in, independently of our cross-match with the rosters of the Department of Mental Health, and we found that on the north side of the city, which is relatively affluent, there was a high concentration of known people that were already accessing care at community mental health centers. On the west side and on the south side, not so affluent, not so much. And so we then, by combining those things, this was the next, sort of advance that happened with this simple system, we now had a very accurate map of the folks that ought to have been served by the Department of Mental Health. And we then had a very efficient way of making trackable, accountable referrals back to the community mental health centers. The third thing that happened was we had this, so all of a sudden now this is great. Now we can have the treatment teams in the community talk to the treatment teams in the jail, and all is well. Well, of course, you already heard about HIPAA. So the direction could only go in one direction, and we needed a release of information for it to go in the other direction, and we all knew that that was not going to work. So what happened, the very brief version of the story, within 3 months, I went to a bunch of advocacy groups. I said, hey, we should really change this so we could have bidirectional communication. The initial reaction we have referred to as the Frau-Brugger reaction, from Young Frankenstein. But then they realized, oh, wait a minute, it really would be stupid not to do this. And within 3 months, a friend, an attorney at the University of Chicago Law School, crafted an exception to the Illinois Confidentiality Act, which lasts to this day. That system is still being used to this day. And so that was in 2001. So it's just sort of a tease to suggest how technology, even really simple technology, can have dramatic impact on lots of people and on vast systems of care. So that's the preamble. So, there we go. All right, so here's one of my favorite adages. Every system's perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So don't blame the system. Don't blame the outcomes, blame the system. If you don't like the outcomes, fix the system. And this I was just alluding to, right? Many large populations receive poor health care. They don't use social services, the so-called social determinants of disease, because the systems are complicated and confusing. And this results in duplicative services, poor untrackable outcomes, little accountability of the providers. You don't know how to spend the money to get better results, exorbitant healthcare costs, otherwise known as low value for healthcare dollar, regressive public policies that are really designed to maintain the status quo, and avoidable pain and suffering. So those are examples of things we would like to not have happen. Oh, geez, it stole the sort of, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development kind of looks at qualities, markers across the 30 or so biggest developed market economies in the world. And this graph, which some of you may be familiar with, shows by percent GDP how much these 30 or so developed market economies spend on social services and on healthcare. And you'll notice that the vast majority spend about $1 on healthcare for every $2 that they spend on social services. That's a good idea, it turns out, because now you're preemptively anticipating things that will ultimately cause diseases to get more severe and more expensive and will decrease the quality of life. Of course, the United States there spends 55 cents on social service for every dollar spent, and we get the results that that brings. Oh. Now, how did I do that? Oh, there it is. All right, now here's the Patti Smith quote. I figure it would be appropriate for Dr. Dave here. So, artists, musicians, and scientists, if you have any kind of visionary aptitude, it's often something that you don't have a choice in. You have to do it. So, speaking of visionaries, you may recognize this guy. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but he truly is a visionary, and he's a heroic visionary. And most of you know the story, but it bears repeating. When he looked like this, and he saw a need and an outcome that he didn't like, he literally risked incarceration to do the right thing and really create the progenitor of what ultimately would become Matt, one could argue. That's pretty visionary. And he did that because he saw a need and he did the right thing, and he couldn't help himself. And we love him for that. So, Dr. Dave. So now, by analogy, I want to show you a less heroic but also fairly impressive visionary. All right, this is the audience participation part of the program. Anybody take a stab at who this is? That's Steve Allen, that's correct, but the person in question is the guy sitting next to him, the 17-year-old sitting next to him. No, that's not me. This is 1965. Close. It's Ray Kurzweil. That name ring a bell? That's what he looks like now. You may recognize him. He's given a lot of TED Talks. So he's the guy who basically designed Dragon Naturally Speaking, the mathematics for flatbed scanners, which got him to hang out with blind people because they would use it to scan the pages and it would speak using the Dragon Naturally Speaking, which made him friends with Stevie Wonder, which got him to hang out with musicians, which got him to design Kurzweil keyboards, which is the industry. So he's one of these guys, right? And he's also a futurist. And he's written a number of really fantastic books and great TED Talks. If you're unfamiliar with him, I would recommend Googling and watching some of his TED Talks. And so this is one of the things, and this is a book worth reading, I would say, The Age of Spiritual Machines. One of his big things that he talks about is the convergence of man and machine, kind of an extension of what Catherine was just talking about. And he's pretty out there, and he really like pinpoints when this is going to happen. I mean, this is basically the Terminator storyboard, right? But he doesn't think it has to end that way. But he is clear, and by the way, it's already happening, that we are, as we just heard, more and more dependent on our devices. You know, you lose your cell phone, it's like having a stroke. You can't really imagine life without it, right? So this is like the tide coming in, it's going to happen. So how can we harness it, right? So before, here's a common misconception I have certainly learned as I got more and more involved in IT. There's a tendency to want to think of IT as a magic bullet and to kind of like think about the system right away. And many smart people who know much more about IT than I ever hoped to always tell me the same thing, which is you have to understand the use cases. And I used to hate that term, but you have to understand what it actually is that you want to do. That first frame, like what about the outcomes do you want changed? You have to be clear about that before you start talking about the sexy technology. So here I would argue for the application relevant to the addiction community are the use cases that are important. One is to recognize that addiction is a chronic disease. One is the treatment has to last long enough. This is a thing that I first learned from Dr. Dave. But, we'll get to that. That assessment is really an entree to treatment and a very important thing to conceptualize individually who the person is. And that you need to then match services to that person's needs, not a cookie cutter approach. And you have to appreciate the special complex relationship that often occurs between the criminal justice system and people with addiction. Those are, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty important list. And with those as kind of the organizing principles, you can kind of take a look at how technology can help work with that. So addiction is a chronic disease. Well, these are the kinds of things that we all are familiar with that have to happen. I'm going to take a wild guess here is that it's probably not uncommon that you encounter somebody who has gone through this process, or you're picking them up at some end of the process and you don't have the other information and you can't get your arms around what's really happening with this person. So trying to engage them in treatment and then actually maintain them in treatment can be very, very challenging, especially if they're homeless, especially if they're in and out of corrections, especially if they're working with 3 other agencies, et cetera. And this is the Dr. Dave thing. You got to get them. There are physiologic changes that happen to the brain that with abstinence or with treatment. And the longer a person is abstinent, certainly in spades for the first 90 to 180 days, the greater the likelihood of success is. And so there's really an intensive push, especially at the beginning of engagement, to support someone so that they can be successful, or you're probably they're not going to be successful. To really understand the person's strengths and weaknesses at the beginning so you can customize how to best support them, the nature and the extent of the drug problem. What are their assets, the family support, their employment history, their motivation, why are they showing up now? And the various things that may be impediments to their success. Run-ins with the law, there may be a mental health issue, their general health may be failing, et cetera, et cetera. You really have to know all of these things. You can't compartmentalize care and expect to be successful. And again, That's just sort of matching care. It's just matching care. It's the social determinants, understanding what those are, and really knowing how to coordinate all those things. And then, all the special considerations of working with the criminal justice system as a very common sort of part of working with folks that have addictions. And to recognize that you have to, and talk about multiple what's the word I'm groping for? Society, not societies, but you know what I mean. Forget it, it's late in the afternoon. You have to really have a Venn overlap between the public safety world, which has its own rules and regulations, and the public health approach. And they have strengths and weaknesses, and they're often antagonistic with one another, but you have to be good at blending them. So, maybe if I do this. It's a little better. So, the role of technology. So what are common aspects that can help create workarounds and address some of these needs that we just kind of quickly went through with the use cases? So one of the things, I'm going to get a little, very little, but high-level wonky for a second. This is something called a multi-tenancy design of a system. So what's really hard to do is really just plop stuff down in different places and have it be sort of a turnkey cookie-cutter solution. One way around that is to have what's called a multi-tenancy design, which allows you to take common system elements and blend them together in customized ways for particular applications. What's nice about that is it better addresses the end user's needs, and it facilitates machine learning, which is the acquisition so that the machine can kind of learn, or the system can learn by experience as it compares common elements with different contextual deployments. So that's one thing that's kind of, and it drives the price down often for what's able to be made available to folks. You want to have linkable systems, right? Everyone gets emotionally attached to their IT system. It's usually a love-hate relationship, but people are reluctant to let their systems go. So the architecture, ideally, should be able to really recognize lots of different systems so that you can actually link them together in a practical, functional way. And that ability should be quite agile, because one of the things that happens is once you get people using the system, and you no longer have to hold them at gunpoint, they generally become excited and have all kinds of useful, important ideas of how to modify the system. And you don't want to be living in a Dilbert cartoon. You want the system to be agile to respond to their observations and improvements to the system, so they don't get frustrated and actually intensify their love for the system. And then you want it to be easily scalable. Likely you're going to start with maybe a couple of deployments in an area, and you want those things to be able to become confluent as word gets around and people get excited, and you can see all of the benefits of making more complex systems. So those are ideal and platform agnostic, so that it can really talk to lots of different systems. So that's what you want to have happen. And so that kind of looks like something like this, right? With data sources coming in from lots of places, accommodating lots of different data formats, with all of the various rules of engagement. So you don't break any laws, and you can then see what laws have to be broken to improve treatment, and et cetera. So that's what you really want to achieve in a system to address those use cases. Now this is a little bit dated, but for those of you, these are relational databases. That probably rings a bell for some of you. So this is part of how architecture used to be, and it made it really, really hard to change systems. This is really where Dilbert comes from, right? Made hard to change systems the bigger and more complex a system became. So we don't like these. That's all I'm going to say. We're going to move on. They don't really exist very much anymore. And now here's another sort of term of art that you may have heard, metadata. Metadata is, as the term implies, basically data that sits on top of other data. Systems that are built on a metadata platform are much more agile and much less of a pain in the ass to change, which is a good thing. And it really facilitates these kinds of important interactions as you grow a system. This is this is not a turkey, this is an actual metadata map that we put together for one of the clients that we were working for. This is their intake process. And just to kind of give you a sense, they represent different levels of information for each important node in the activity. And it becomes, if you can imagine, relatively easy to modify the modifiers because they're not interdependent in the way that a relational database was interdependent. So it's a good thing, and this is the basis for the agility. And then you can really address these kinds of nodes and make complex systems that actually give you a radar screen that can be populated with this kind of stuff, which is what we want. And then we heard a little about wearables. You know, many of us are wearing wearables, and I'm not going to go into it, but just the easier it is to collect information creates potentials of clever ways of using it, and that's just coming down the pike, and it lends itself to all kinds of creative solutions. In terms of systems, this is the sequential intercept model. Again, probably you're pretty familiar with this. I put this up here because it's really an important thing to take into consideration because, again, technology is not a magic bullet. Technology has to contend with realities that often are resistant to playing nice in the sandbox. But the sequential intercept model is maybe the highest yield place to have it's a fish in a barrel scenario where you can impose all kinds of strategies to extract people that have come to the attention of the criminal justice system and bring them out into competent holding environments and break that cycle. And lots of folks that we deal with find themselves engaged with the criminal justice system. So this is a very important sort of aspect of reality to become comfortable with. I won't go into this right now. This is actually a screenshot of a system we developed, and it gives you an idea of using all those nodes and information from those nodes, of being able to portray a person, a fictitious person, Frank Lyman, with elements of care that represent categories of care that were determined by multiple contributors to the treatment plan, each of which has responsibility for an aspect of that plan. So the plan is not simply held by one entity under one roof. If a person needs to have connection with as many attributes in the community as necessary, there are actual humans that are, and organizations that are held accountable for that aspect of the treatment plan, and you then can actually trick the entire system into thinking it's part of a competent system, and that can all contribute in a unique way to each person's individual needs. So this started, like I said, way back when in 2001 when I was in Chicago. One of the reasons I moved to Vermont, we like to ski. My wife and I are both from New Jersey. It was close enough. But also Vermont is kind of like San Francisco in a lot of ways, right? It's got a very sort of social contract mentality, essentially one level of government. It's a pretty good petri dish for the kinds of systems that I get involved with. So that's one of the reasons I went there. And the school has been very, very receptive. And as this has grown, we have become involved with lots of other places that are playing in the sandbox with us. So a lot of stuff that we've been developing, and this has been really developing in an accelerating way over the last 10 years, has been with players from those other places as well. So again, this is the sort of the general structure here. This is like the intake data stuff and the sources of data. That's largely determined by who's willing to do that, or who you can just pull the information from, whether or not they want you to, and then how much political pressure you can exert on non-players once you have other people adopting things. Of then supporting case management teams as a really sort of a staple for dealing with the populations that we're largely talking about. Tying together all of these community assets in what we like to refer to as a sort of a virtual medical home to kind of have individualized medical homes for each person, and then being able to do all kinds of analytics and change policy by virtue of what we're able to do. So that's the sort of the holy grail that we've been developing. Now, And so we, public health model, the so-called triple aim, which is, population health, improve care for individuals, improve care for populations, do it at less cost. This is what we want to do. And then looking at big data, looking at noise, and finding emergent order. So I'll say one final thing here. That's all great. Now, I don't have my Machiavelli slide, but it's one of my favorite slides. My favorite Machiavelli quote, it goes something like, if you want to be a change agent, you have plenty of people who want to slit your throat, I'll paraphrase, and you have a handful of lukewarm supporters of people who get it, that they're going to benefit from the changes you want to bring about. So, public health as a practical system. You want to use current knowledge to have maximum impact. So what do you have to do? You have to identify problems that are addressable by collective action. And ideally, problems that are kind of at the front end of the activity chain so you can have upstream solutions. Then, since collective is a trigger word for politics, you have to understand all of the people who want to slit your throat. And this is the graveyard of where most things die. And I'm probably preaching to the choir for many of you, and for those of you who are still bright-eyed and optimistic, your challenge is to remain bright-eyed and optimistic despite the realities that you have to confront to do this work. And I'm obviously not kidding. And if you can do that, you can do this work. If you can't, you will burn out and you'll find something else to do. But that's just essential. We used to joke in Chicago, you may have heard, politics is kind of interesting. You put your apple on a pedestal, you stand back here with your bow and arrow, and you take aim at the apple, and you have 4 rotating bins, each of which has a slit in it, representing the various levels of government, and you wait till the slits line up, and then you can maybe hit the arrow. So once you figure out how to get around that, then you can actually put together solutions and have collective engagement of resources. And that's the trick of taking good ideas, but actually having them see the light in the real world. And it goes from the Sisyphus effect to the snowball effect. And, tipping points. I don't play golf, but they tell me when you have a good shot in golf, it compensates for the 50 other games that you played that you hated. So it's a little bit like that. And I will leave you with this quote: progress might have been all right once, but it's gone on for too long.